day, my friends. It's your old pal Jordan the Lion. How are you all doing today? I hope you said well. I'm doing great. We're actually making our way out of Philadelphia and we're headed a little bit north today. And we're gonna stop and visit the gravesite of the great Jayne Mansfield. I have been to her cenotaph in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, but this will be my first time actually getting to visit her actual grave. This is someone who found a way of making a living in just about every avenue of entertainment during her life, and all she really ever wanted was just to be famous and to be beautiful, and she definitely accomplished those. So, Daze with Jordan the Lion, Jayne Mansfield, You All begins right now. That is a phenomenal use of the Muffler Man idea for an ice cream parlor. He is monstrous size. He's got the wedge cap. He's got the scooper, the ice cream. This place is called the Inside Scoop. How cool. That's a scooper that means business. Look at the ice cream cones out there on the front of the door. That's great too. Gotta love roadside America, baby. Gotta. There's my buddy. He's with us as always. We're actually passing by the Martin Guitar Company factory. They have closed down their tours of the factory for about the last 2 years since COVID started. But I'm hoping to get to do that someday. Martin is kind of the benchmark for great acoustic guitars, and that's what Willie Nelson's Trigger is. No relation, but Jayne Mansfield's real last name was Palmer. Her name was Vera Jane Palmer. And right up here to the left is the cemetery. We finally made it. Fairview Cemetery. She is very easy to find here. I'll show you why. Now, she's not the only heart headstone in this cemetery, but definitely the biggest, and pretty easy to find her because if there was anything that Jayne was known for outside of her beautiful looks and blonde hair and large bosoms, it was her love of hearts and her love of pink. And when you make it out here to her grave, you actually can see a big heart. We live to love you more each day, it says. Then it has her name, Jayne Mansfield. Vera Jane Palmer was her birth name, and the reason that she's buried out here is because she was raised out here in this part of Pennsylvania. I believe it's called Penn Argyl. Her father sadly passed away when she was 3. He was coming back from a doctor's appointment where he had just had a clear bill of health and ended up having a heart attack on the way home, and it was extremely traumatizing for her. She was in the car and loved him so much because he doted all over her. From the time she was a little girl, her parents treated her like basically like a princess. Her mom would dress her up like Shirley Temple, and they got her violin lessons, and she, you know, could play the violin. But sadly, him passing away, some people believe that it was the start of like a, you know, always searching for a father figure. But she wanted to be buried out here because the true love of her life is her second husband, Mickey Hargitay, and he said that there was a time where they came back here together to where she grew up, and she took him around to her elementary school and showed him where she used to play on the swings, and then brought him out here and said that her father was buried out here and that she wanted to be buried here as well, to be with him, because he died at the age of 34, and she said that she thought she was going to die early and she was going to die at the age of 34 as well. So her mother ended up remarrying and they moved to Texas, and she ended up developing early, Jayne did, as a teenager, and had a lot of boys chasing her. So she ended up getting married and having her first child by the age of 16. And when they first got married, they did it, her and her husband Paul Mansfield did it in a different town so that no one would know, because Apparently, if they knew that she was married, she wasn't allowed to attend high school any longer in those days. Jane's father must be somewhere close by here, because I'm seeing that right over here would have been her mother, Vera J. Palmer Piers. So looks like that would have been her second husband, but I don't see a headstone for Jane's father. And this one looks like this would be her grandparents. So once it came out that Jane was pregnant, because she, you know, obviously had a baby, they ended up moving to Austin. Her and Paul moved to Austin, and she started to try to do theater. She started doing plays and things. And then the Korean War came about right after he graduated, and he went and served in the war. But she had been doing pageants and all kinds of stuff in the Austin area, and was just kind of like winning all these queen of this and queen of that at local festivals and everything because of her beauty. So he knew how pretty she was, and people had already asked to take pictures of her and things like that. So he told her, once I come back from Korea, I'll help you get your shot, and we will move to Hollywood together and work on your career. And so that's exactly what they did. Now, God love her, Jayne Mansfield had a gift of beauty, a gift of a pretty large chest before there were breast implants, and she had a pretty big self-confidence. She could look in a mirror and she believed that she was looking at the most beautiful woman in the world. And so when she came to Hollywood, she had no fear. She called Paramount Studios and told them she was there to be a movie star, and when she had a reading, she came in and did something from Joan of Arc, and the man at Paramount said, you know, why are you just not taking advantage of your obvious good traits? And so she ended up getting sent out on a press junket for a movie starring Jane Russell. And while she was out there, Jane, you know, knowing, you know, some people always thought because she had a, she basically had a persona and played in a lot of movies as a ditzy blonde, that she was dumb, and she really wasn't. She was really smart, so she looked for all kinds of ways to get herself publicity. And so while they were out promoting this Jane Russell movie, Jane borrowed a bathing suit, Jayne Mansfield borrowed a bathing suit, and while the press was all around taking photos, she jumped in the water, and the bathing suit was too small, and it popped open, and when she came out of the water, everything that she had was there to see, and it became quite a spectacle. And so she wanted to be the Marilyn Monroe image, where Marilyn didn't like being seen as this beautiful blonde. Jane embraced it and liked it and was trying to be there, but you know, a lot of people saw what she was doing as kind of making enemies by upstaging Jane Russell on the press junket and basically stealing Marilyn Monroe's look in the early 50s. You know, she ended up getting a contract with Warner Brothers, and they put her in like 3 B movies that didn't do well, and basically ended her contract, and she was only 22 years old by that point. Now, her husband Paul said that they really got married, you know, in like a fit of passion, and as Jane became a bigger star and her name became Jayne Mansfield, he didn't want to be Mr. Jayne Mansfield, and he saw that her career was taking off, so they ended up getting a divorce. And Jane, fearing that her, you know, career might be over because she'd already lost her contract after 3 movies, ended up auditioning for a play in New York and got in the play on Broadway, basically playing a role that was written for Mamie Van Dorn, and it was basically a, you know, a blonde just like Jayne Mansfield. So while in New York, she went to a show in the Latin Quarter that was starring Mae West, and Mae West had all these bodybuilder hunks in her show, and one of them was a man named Mickey Hargitay, who had been an award-winning bodybuilder, and just the year before, and Jane saw him on stage with Mae, and it was said that when the waiter came and asked what she wanted to order, she said, "I'll take a steak and the one on the right." And they ended up meeting after the show and pretty much became inseparable. They would go all over New York together, and he was really strong, and he'd been an acrobat, so he would lift her up over his head, and she would, you know, pretend to be like a swan over his head. And Mae West found out about this and thought that it was disrespectful to her because she was a sex symbol, And so she told Mickey she wanted him to renounce Jane in the press, and he did the opposite. He came out and said how much he adored Jayne Mansfield, and they soon ended up getting married. And he was very supportive of her career. During the 50s and the early 60s, it was easy for someone like Jane to have a career because it was like, you know, they wanted those hourglass shapes and those blondes for the movies. And she ended up getting another contract with 20th Century Fox because Marilyn was under contract to them and had been having problems, like not showing up and things like that. So they ended up giving Jayne Mansfield a contract there as well. And Jane, again, you know, didn't really do well in the movies, but she was really good at the press junkets. She showed up when Sophia Loren, they're doing this press junket for Sophia Loren honoring her, and Jayne Mansfield shows up and has this really low-cut dress on, showing everything. And, you know, then those photos became famous of Sophia Loren looking at Jayne Mansfield's breasts. And that's when, you know, they would start deciding, you know, Jane had one child already, but she wanted to have like 12. And so her and Mickey started having children. They ended up having 3 children together. And he had been when he first moved from Hungary, he had been a carpenter. And so she bought the mansion that would later become known as the Pink Palace. And he would start helping her design it and come to realize all of her dreams, the way that she wanted to look, with all these heart-shaped pools and bathtubs and gold and pink everywhere. He would help basically start constructing all of that for her. And Mickey was said to be very, very supportive of Jane's career. I mean, in times where she didn't have a lot going on, he would make contacts and try and get her work, help get her contracts. And at one point, like I said, he had been an acrobat, and so when her career hit a lull, Vegas was kind of starting to take off, and between the two of them, they came up with this like acrobat show. And when she had been making $2,500 a week with a studio contract, she now was getting offers of $25,000 a week to be on the Strip of Las Vegas. Now, unfortunately, because of who knows what, you know, career or just life changes or what, Mickey and Jane seemed to grow apart, although they were still best friends. And Jane called a press conference and apparently without telling Mickey, announced with him standing right beside her that she was divorcing him. Yeah, that's, yeah, pretty amazing. And then, you know, shortly thereafter, she would meet a director. She had always gotten movies, basically with her being the ditzy blonde, and she felt that this director, Matt Cimber, could finally give her dramatic roles, and that's basically what he promised. And so they ended up getting married and having a child together, and nothing in her career really seemed to have taken off, and they didn't really have a great relationship. So even then, she decided she was going to divorce Matt Cimber, but he told her that he would fight her for their child. He wanted the custody of their child, and so she hired a lawyer that was pretty cutthroat named Sam Brody. And apparently Sam Brody, even though he had a family, a wife and kids, and a really successful law practice, he fell in love with Jane, became basically obsessed with her, and left his family to be with her. She loved kids and she loved her animals. She had so many animals, like donkeys and dogs and all kinds of things. So it's kind of cool to see somebody left some dog tags, because when she passed away in the accident, her dogs were in the car, as well as her kids, but her kids ended up surviving. Now, it was said once she hooked up with hiring Sam Brody that, you know, he fell in love with her, and she wasn't really doing well with money. She had been making a lot of TV appearances, basically doing anything that you could, doing Vegas again, any little ways of making money and keeping your name out there and with publicity. But during the 60s, after Marilyn Monroe died, the look of the blonde bombshell went out. It was like the kiss of death. Nobody wanted to hire somebody like that. And so basically she hired Sam Brody to be her lawyer, and some people believe that she just didn't have the funds to pay him, so basically became his girlfriend. And he was apparently a heavy drinker. He was very abusive, and he booked her for all of these nightclub dates when she had a pretty heavy drinking problem. And it was said that, you know, on a string of dates in the UK that he had booked her on, the clubs actually canceled her bookings because those two, Jane and Sam Brody, apparently were so physically violent in some cases with each other that she would show up to perform and had bruises all over her legs, and they said physically, I guess what was said was that they couldn't have her perform because she couldn't wear the dresses she was contracted to wear with all the bruises. So she was out on the road in the US doing a string of dates in these kind of like, you know, southern bars and lounges and places that weren't really the best, but because of her history and who she was and her image, people always want to go out there and see somebody perform, you know, that has that. And so apparently she wasn't even supposed to be performing the date in Biloxi. Mamie Van Dorn said in an interview that it was actually her booking, and that something came up where she couldn't make it, so she called Jane and said, can you do my booking, and the one that you were supposed to do a couple months later, I'll do that one for you. And so that's what ended up happening. So she had done this show and apparently had a hard time waking up in the morning, so she just wanted to make it to the next town. So the club that she was performing at had a car, and they found her a driver. Apparently the driver, they say, hadn't had much sleep in the last couple days, and they were headed off 2 hours to get to Louisiana for Jane's next show. Now Mickey says that along the way they stopped off at a gas station, and that Jane called him from the gas station, and they were talking on the phone, and then her significant other, which would have been Sam Brody, Mickey could hear him yelling at her in the background saying something, and Jane said, okay, honey, I'll have to call you later, So even up till the end, she was calling Mickey honey, and, you know, basically seeming though as he was the one that she truly loved. So the story was that they got back in the car, and my friend Scott Michaels actually owns the car that they crashed in, and he interviewed, I believe, the girlfriend of the driver, and they said that Jane was a major scrapbooker, and so she was always having the lights on inside of the car so she could do her scrapbooks, and that Sam Brody had asked the driver to take the batteries out of the, or take the lights out so that she couldn't do it. So those were removed, and they started driving, and apparently there's always this story that they got behind a mosquito fogger truck and didn't see the truck in front of them, and basically just drove right into the back of a semi, which brought about the Mansfield gate, this safety device they would put on the back of semis so that the car couldn't go under the semi like it had. But when they arrived, they did find all three in the front seat, which would have been the driver, Sam Brody, and Jane had passed away on impact. There was a report that Jane had been decapitated, which wasn't true. She was wearing a wig, and the wig came off, but word got around the next day that Jayne Mansfield was gone. Now it's crazy, even though she was married to Matt Cimber at the time of her death, apparently Mickey petitioned the courts and they nullified their divorce, and so Mickey actually was granted the right to make the decisions for Jane's burial, and he decided that she would be here like her wishes to him when they came out here together. Being the eternal lover of fame and Hollywood and beauty and everything, she has a beautiful headstone cenotaph at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, but her earthly remains are here with her family the way she wanted. And sadly, it was a young life ended. It's really crazy for me to be standing out here and looking at this and thinking of the day that she brought Mickey out here, was showing him where her father would have been buried and telling him that she foresaw an early ending. Sadly, Jayne Mansfield's Pink Palace, which she was very brilliant when she got that house with Mickey, they couldn't furnish a lot of it originally, so she would make deals with people. If they gave her free stuff, she would make sure that it was shown. And so she would basically have an open door policy to reporters. If they wanted to come to her house, she loved to open the doors and show off everything in the house, share her life, her personal life with everyone. So sadly, that house is now been demolished, and what few artifacts remain of it, my friend Scott Michaels has. He also, like I said, has the car that she perished in. Rest in peace, Jayne Mansfield. I want to show you this other headstone I saw on another part of the cemetery when I was coming in. It's kind of interesting. And I just happened to notice this one. This is worth pointing out. I've never really seen a yin-yang as a headstone, but interesting. Well, my friends, we're going to call it a day. Thank you all for watching. I hope you were a Jayne Mansfield fan. She was very likable. She was very well-spoken, even though a lot of people thought she was a dumb blonde. She was actually tested at genius levels, and her whole career was basically, you know, her just analyzing how Hollywood worked and what sold, and her presenting that as her image. And it's kind of an amazing story. She got to live out her dream, and sadly she had an untimely death. If it's your first time here, please hit the subscribe button, please hit the like and the bell for notifications. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you all next time. Have a great night and goodbye.